A Tale for the Time Being. Novel by Ruth Ozeki. Ruth. She read the last of Benoit's translated pages and placed it on top of the pile on the sofa next to her. She stared out the window at the horizon. Storm clouds darkened the sky with such heavy striation that, were it not for the tiny flecks of white caps kicked up by the wind and adding texture to the water, she would have been unable to trace the line between dark sky and dark sea. The waves looked so small from where she sat on the couch. Hard to imagine. From up close, they would look much bigger. Hard to miss. He flew into a wave, she thought. The gusty wind battered the house, making the old wood beams creak. Outside, the trees groaned and swayed. Living wood. Now doesn't know this yet. She still thinks her great-uncle flew his plane into the enemy's battleship. She thinks he died a war hero, carrying out his mission. She doesn't know he scuttled it. How can this be? The electricity was on, but already the lights had flickered several times. Somewhere a tree had come down across a power line. The generator was still at the shop in Campbell River. They were hanging by a thread. She's read his Japanese letters, the official one she found in the picture frame and the others that Jiko gave her, but she hasn't mentioned anything about a secret French diary. Does she even know about it? Where is it? If Haruki number 1 had gotten drunk and burned the diary, or taken it with him on his mission, then it would long ago have turned to ashes scattered in the wind, or cellulose dissolving in the sea. She picked up the waxy packet containing the composition booklet that Benoit had returned with the translated pages. She turned it over and studied it carefully. It's real, but how did it get here? How did it end up in the freezer bag and here in my hands? She wanted to discuss this with Oliver, to ask these questions out loud, but he was out in the rain looking for pesto. She unwrapped the waxy paper and unfolded the booklet. She ran her fingers across the page. The paper was cheap. The ink was faded, but she could tell it had once been a dark shade of indigo blue. He'd hidden it in his lunchbox, under his rice. He'd hidden it inside his coat, next to his chest. She closed her eyes and held the booklet to her face, inhaling deeply, but the only smell was from the wax and the sea. Now must read this, and her father, too. They have to know the truth. She opened her eyes and folded up the diary again, packing it away. It was growing dark outside. She looked at the sky soldier watch to check the time. The watch was still ticking. Where was Oliver? Haruki number 1 was struggling with the most profound moral and existential issues of genocide and war and the consequences of his imminent death, and we're upset about a missing cat? How is this even possible? But it was possible and true. They'd been distracted ever since the cat had run away, and even more so after they'd learned about Benoit's dog being eaten by wolves. Every time Oliver heard a noise outside, he would stop what he was doing and go to the door, open it, and listen. He listened to the screech of the owls, the howling of the wolves, and even the cawing of the ravens with equal trepidation. I'm sure he's fine, he said, trying to make himself feel better. He's such a little guy. Just a scrawny morsel. Who would bother to eat him? But they both knew that the forest was full of predators who would love to eat a little cat for dinner. Finally, he couldn't stand it any longer, and when the wind picked up he went out to search for him. Ruth felt bad. It was her fault for getting angry and scaring Pesto out of bed and into the night. She wished she'd been able to contain her anger. She wished Oliver hadn't made her mad in the first place. The rain was starting to fall in earnest, so she went downstairs to throw some wood on the fire and found that the stack was getting low. She put on her raincoat and gumboots, grabbed the headlamp and the firewood sling, and headed out to the woodpile. The wind had really picked up, and the cedar limbs were thrashing. Where was he? It wasn't safe to be out in the woods in high winds like this. The trees were groaning and creaking under the gale's assault. For such tall trees, their roots were surprisingly shallow, and the forest floor was soggy from rain. She thought for a moment she should go out and look for him, but then realized that was foolish. She started pulling the split logs from the pile and stacking them up in the leather sling. Just then she heard a harsh cry from overhead. She looked up. It was the jungle crow, perched on its usual spot on the branch of the cedar. The crow looked down at her, fixed her with a beady eye. "Caw," it cried, with an urgency that sounded like a warning. She looked behind her at the house. The windows had gone black. The power was out. Suddenly, she felt afraid. What should I do? The rain beat against her face as she turned back to the crow. "Go," she said. "Please, go and find him." The crow just continued to watch her. Stupid, she thought. Talking to a bird, but there was no one else nearby, and somehow just hearing her own voice helped to calm her. The crow stretched its neck and shook its feathers. She heaved the heavy sling filled with firewood onto her shoulder and headed toward the darkened house. "Caw," cried the crow again, and when she turned back, she saw Oliver emerging from the wine-lashed trees, dripping with rain. Seeing her standing there with the wood, he spread out his arms. His wet hands were empty. "No cat."